Hi, everybody. Welcome to our panel discussion about the upcoming election and the American left. I have a couple thank yous to start. As you saw in the video, the Aqua Community Center is calling for donations. They were pretty hard hit by COVID, and if you could help them out, that would be awesome. We're so thankful that they could host us here today. I also want to thank the organizers, the Lincoln Internationals, and the DSA Berlin, the Democratic Socialists of America here in Berlin, and also our audience live and online. I know I am, and our lovely panelists as well are looking forward to your questions. If you are watching online on theleftberlin.com, you can click the Ask a Question button. And if you're watching on Facebook or on Twitter, you can just put that right in the comment section. And we'll be taking questions throughout, so if you want to try out that comment function and just let us know where you're watching from, how excited you are to be here, say hi. So let's introduce our panelists. We have Jeremy Osborne to my left, Hannah Greskevich a little further left, and the furthest left, we have Ted Knudsen. If you guys could just say a sentence about yourselves, who you are, what organizing groups you work with, and such. Jeremy.
So my name is Jeremy Osborne. I am active with Black Lives Matter, and was also active for Germany for Bernie, which became, it was Berlin for Bernie, then it became Germany for Bernie, and now the first international chapter, will be the first international chapter of Democratic Socialists of America.
I'm Hannah. I come from Poland, but lived in the UK for a long time, and I am active in Lincoln Internationals and in DSA Berlin, which is a Polish feminist organization, collective.
I'm Ted Knudsen. I'm originally from the US and have been active in, like Jeremy, with Germany for Bernie, then turning into DSA Berlin. I've also done some work with the Lincoln Internationals.
And I'm Michelle Hayner. I'm also a part of the DSA Berlin. And just to kind of set the scene, the U.S. presidential election is, as I'm sure you all know, coming up on Tuesday. The left has two unappealing choices this time around, a right-wing authoritarian, Donald Trump, and of course Joe Biden, the centrist Democrat who has supported austerity, overseas intervention, and refuses to ban fracking. And that's the lesser evil. So this meeting, we just kind of want to talk about the dilemma that faces socialists and whether they should vote for Biden, whether they should vote third party, what other forms of action should we be taking that move beyond the ballot box. So if you guys just kind of want to tell me if you're voting, Hannah, hypothetically, are you voting? Who are you voting for?
I already sent in my absentee ballot. I'm registered in Arkansas in the United States, and I voted for the Green Party candidate. I voted for Howie Hawkins and Angela Walker. I mean, I could give a big, speech about how, Arkansas is not a swing state, and that's the reason I felt free to vote third party. But it's not really true. The real reason I voted third party is because I saw it as a vote against the DNC. After the shenanigans that they pulled this year and in 2016 to actively undermine Bernie Sanders and Bernie Sanders' campaign, I had just decided, to be fair, I voted Green Party, to be fair, the last election and the one before that. But I am done with being browbeaten into supporting candidates that I do not support because of this lesser of two evil dynamic that is actively created by the Democratic establishment. They feed off of this dynamic. There's this great interview with David Graeber where he talks about this, where the Democrats and the Republicans feed off of each other. For the Democrats, they then point to the other side and say, look, they're idiots, they're idiots, they're idiots, and then they get to feel morally superior. But what they fail to understand is the real appeal of someone like Trump, for example, is the fact that he kind of rejects a lot of this elitist virtue signaling. Yes, he is a horrible candidate and all of those other things, but criticizing him because he eats McDonald's all the time, okay, maybe somebody doesn't need to be eating McDonald's all the time, but a lot of people in the United States, for whatever reason, they live in places where they do not have access to lots of nutritious food. I mean, that's just one simple example. It's just a lot of these elitist fixations that keep the Democratic establishment from being able to really understand Trump's appeal. And this dynamic where they don't really have to offer anything, they being the Democrats, they don't really have to offer anything because all they do is point to the Republicans and say, if you guys don't vote for us, it's going to be so much worse. And I'm not going to play that game anymore. Votes have to be earned in a democracy, period. And it's strange that in a country like the United States that is so intensely capitalistic, right? If you invent some new car or whatever and it doesn't sell, it's your fault. Capitalism, you failed. But with politicians and political parties, who have immense resources and this team of experts around them, they can't seem to get votes, and it's everybody's fault but theirs. I just don't think so. No, if people don't vote for you, maybe you should change your platform. And all of this kind of doomsday rhetoric about how if Trump wins, it's going to be the end of the world, et cetera, et cetera. Well, there's a very simple solution, right? Instead of shaming people for not voting, change your platform to appeal to the people, the 40 some odd or more % of people in the United States who are eligible voters who do not vote. Otherwise, you're not getting any support from me. That's how I feel about it.
Thanks, Jeremy. Hannah.
All right, me. Well, I can't vote. Maybe I'll talk briefly about when I did vote, and then 2 disastrous elections, or 3 in the last year.
Please.
So the first one that happened was the Polish parliamentary election, and we do have proportional representation, which means that your vote does somewhat count. It also means that we do have very extreme right people in the parliament as of last year. But we also have the left in the parliament for the first time since the 90s, since the fall of communism and the first kind of wave of solidarity being turned into an actual political party, who went in with, I think, 12%, so they have 48 MPs. So I voted for the left, and I voted specifically for a candidate, because the left is a coalition in Poland. I voted specifically for a candidate that I felt very strongly about because of the way our lists work. So I think that is perhaps not such a good parallel to the US election, but what is the presidential election that we had this year. We actually almost had it twice because it was planned initially for May, then it was postponed because of COVID to June. And that was a much more difficult choice because the first time round, the centrist candidate was very poor and she was she had very low polling. But the leftist candidate, Robert Biedroń, is not a very popular person. So it was a very difficult decision. And also we have 2 rounds. So in the first round, you could vote with your conscience. And in the second round, it was inevitable that it's going to be Duda, who is the representative of the Peace Party, even though he's technically not connected to a party, but everybody knows he's a puppet of Kaczynski and the Law and Justice Party. And he was against Trzaskowski, who is the current Warsaw mayor, very much a centrist, very much metropolitan elite kind of person. But again, in Poland, it wasn't so clear that he would be the candidate against Duda because there was a person who came in who is just, he's just a journalist, kind of a personality who actually came quite close to being in the second round. So this was also kind of different in that it wasn't a given. It was a given that it would be Duda with Peace against somebody else that is vaguely centrist because the left just had 0 traction in that particular election. And in that election, I did vote for Trzaskowski for many reasons. One of the main one is that Duda's campaign was so anti the LGBT community that it was, for me, the rhetoric that he was encouraging and the way he was trying to win that election was so toxic and so dangerous that I felt that anything to stop this is a good thing, even though the person I voted for is not my ideal candidate. It's not somebody I would like to see. He is somebody who uses the platform and his and any sort of socially progressive thing to raise his own political platform, but actually it's not fully behind a lot of these things. So we're using the LGBT community as an example. He has signed an LGBT declaration in Warsaw in that they should have rights and hospices for people that have to escape their families, but actually he hasn't really followed through with a lot of this. He has been just using this to win the kind of more left votes, and he succeeded. But again, leftism in Poland is very difficult. But anyway, I did vote for him, and he lost by 2 percentage points. So we had 49 versus 51, which was quite sad. And hopefully you all know what's going on in Poland right now, which is a direct consequence to that election, because we had protests in the summer led by the LGBT community because they've been called an ideology. A lot of places have called for LGBT-free zones, and now they tried to ban, or they have banned effectively abortion 9 days ago. So we're on day 9 of protests and strikes across the country. As we're speaking, there's about 100,000 people in Warsaw alone in the streets. I don't know. But anyway, it's an interesting time. And the other election I voted in was the British election in December last year, which was a catastrophe for the British left because Jeremy Corbyn lost very poorly. And again, it's quite similar to Bernie, I guess, in that he was sabotaged from within the party. He, as it came out yesterday, continues to be sabotaged by the party because he got suspended from the Labour Party yesterday. I can talk more about this later, but again, that campaign, there was no unity. Trying to marry this kind of centrism and the left within that party just didn't function, and they just completely lost. They didn't have a good enough narrative across the board, and the other side were just united, and they have an outright majority in Parliament. So, and I guess based on my experience, I probably would vote for Biden, but would do it not because I want to.
Right. And Ted.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle, and thanks to the organizers and the hosts here. So yeah, I mean, I'm, I guess, of a similar mindset as Hannah, and that being said, I'm very sympathetic to these arguments that Jeremy raised. I do plan to vote for Biden. I've bubbled everything in on my ballot except that, and it's just sort of sitting on my desk, and I haven't quite been able to bring myself to do it yet, but that is my plan. But yeah, I agree with Jeremy. I would also like the DNC to just suffer. I mean, there's I have a lot of animosity towards these people as well, and I agree this sort of lesser of two evils approach to politics, it maybe makes sense once or twice, but how evil can the lesser of two evils be and you still vote for them? It seems like the Republican Party keeps moving right, the Democrat Party just is the Republican Party from about 20 years prior, and so how long can that dynamic go and people on the left still actually vote for the Democrats? I also totally understand that, and as well, voting as an affirmative choice rather than always this sort of, this lesser of two evils approach. Like you said, give me something to vote for if you want me to vote for you. Give me something to work with, which I, definitely see. And in addition to that, a bit more, I guess we could say the sort of anti-Biden side. I find these sort of arguments he's making not very policy heavy, saying, we're going to restore the soul of the nation. I find that very frivolous. And to me, one of the greatest fears actually is that a Biden victory will allow a lot of comfortable liberals to pretend that Trump was just a bad dream. And now everything can go back to normal, and they can ignore the underlying problems that have been there, during Trump and also well before. And even beyond that, I think, unfortunately, what we're going to see if Biden wins is a sort of triumphalism among centrists and liberals, where they say, okay, this Biden victory means that our institutions were good all along. America is, fundamentally good. The arc of history bends toward justice. All of this sort of stuff, and they'll say that this shows that we were right all along. This works. America is good. All of that being said, I do think we need to look at how things are under Trump and the situation now. So, in addition to the obvious policy issues with Trump, destroying the environment, his immigration policy. I mean, you guys know all of this. He's obviously horrendous in terms of policy. So in addition to that, we need to think about how his presence in the White House has affected left politics more generally. And I think any answer to that question has to conclude that it's really been a disaster for the left. Looking at just this most recent 2020 primary, you had large majorities of the Democratic electorate support Bernie Sanders' policy ideas. They like Medicare for all, they want to end these militarist policies, they want free education, and yet Bernie lost by quite a lot, and it really wasn't even close. So like, how do you explain that? And I think the only way, or the most compelling way to explain that, is that this overriding emphasis on getting rid of Trump just drowned out everything else in the Democratic Party. And so, for example, in a lot of polls that were taken, you had about one-third of the Democratic electorate say, the most important thing to me when I vote for someone is that the candidate agrees with me on the issues. 2/3 said, I just want to get rid of Trump. And not very coincidentally, that's about the breakdown you have between Bernie and Biden. And some people did see this coming. For example, there was a 2017 essay from Perry Anderson in the New Left Review, and he observed even back then that, quote, liberal opposition to the Republican regime has already reached such a pitch of intensity that it potentially renders all but invisible any demarcation from it by a left that has only just emerged into daylight as a modest critical mass. So that's 3 years before the primary, and he's already essentially predicting this exact dynamic we're going to see. And it really is a weird thing. Like for this, during the Trump era, you have everyone from neocons like Bill Kristol to the shouting MSNBC types like Rachel Maddow and so on, to Bernie Sanders, all echoing some version of the line that Trump is the most dangerous president in modern American history. And so how do people across this broad spectrum all come together and say that? I mean, it's bizarre, and when that happens, it drowns out the left, and it's not actually able to distinguish itself and draw a clear contrast and offer up those policy solutions. And so getting rid of Trump, to me, would be good for the left because it lets us draw that contrast. Democrats aren't good enough. They don't provide the solutions that we need. And a Biden presidency will make that clear. And in that sense, I think I'm also expecting Biden to be a disastrous president and have a failed presidency, but I think that could be good for the left. And just another quote on this that I think is pretty revealing. This is Benjamin Kunkel. He said, quote, Trump himself has become the national emergency rather than the stagnation, inequity, and perceived decline that made his rise possible in the first place. And so if we can get rid of Trump and get rid of this national emergency of the Trump presidency, it allows us to focus on the actual material emergencies that long predate Trump. The cruel healthcare system, inhumane immigration system, imperialist forever wars, and all the violence committed abroad. Whereas under Trump, these problems are either disregarded because Trump just hogs all the attention, or they're blamed solely on him, acting like all of these just originated with Trump. And under Biden, we'll actually have to address them. They'll become very clear that these weren't just the fault of one president. And showing that Biden and the rest of the Democrats are incapable of solving them, I think gives the left one of its best chances to grow in the future. So to me, that's the best argument I have for voting for Biden.
All right, thank you. We are actually going to kick it off with an audience question. This was submitted on the Left Berlin website, so I'm glad that's working, and I want to encourage more questions. Greetings from Charlottenburg. I am curious, this is a question directly for Jeremy, so listen up. I'm curious, if you vote against the current candidates, then who do you expect will become the next U.S. president? The Green Party is great, but voting for it will give Trump a vote. How will that promote the Green Party platform and agenda?
Well, so here's the thing, right? If parties get funding depending on depending on the number of votes that they receive. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I don't understand this argument either. If you don't vote for Biden, then you're voting for Trump. Okay, I guess that rationale makes sense if you're in a swing state, but I don't live in a swing state. So I don't understand this rationale. Arkansas is not going to vote for Biden. There's no chance. So why should I unnecessarily stroke the hand of a candidate who has no chance of winning and whose politics that I don't actively support? And again, this dynamic of, if you do this, then this will happen. Okay, But there's a very, very simple solution then. Then the politics of the candidate that isn't Trump, which is Joe Biden, they should be popular enough then, they should be able to mobilize enough people that they can then overwhelm the naysayers like me, right? It's pretty simple. You are not a party is not entitled to votes. And this kind of, I want to come back to this as well, because I think this is really important. This kind of doomsday rhetoric, right, about Trump, it's really kind of belied by the way that the party leadership completely ignores, I wouldn't say ignores, but they don't really put up any kind of real fight against Trump, right? So you have, for example, the most recent example was, Ruth Bader Ginsburg died last month, and then now she's been replaced by Amy Coney Barrett. And, at the beginning, of this whole process, of replacing Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you would have thought that, if the Republicans were the ones who made that decision, that the earth was going to crash into the sun and everything was just going to be on fire, and, we're all just going to be running around screaming, the sky is falling. And then, Amy Coney Barrett was, put on the Supreme Court. She's been confirmed. And now what is the reaction? There was there was this really interesting article, I think it was in the Nation, and it was like why liberals act like they don't have any power, right? And so Nancy Pelosi, she comes out and she talks about, the potential of it not being a peaceful transfer of power, et cetera, and she's, really, fiery rhetoric about how, why don't you honor your oath? And someone says, so are you going to shut down the government? Is the House going to shut down the government to prevent Amy Coney Barrett from being confirmed? No, we can't do that. Because then people wouldn't be able to work, and during this pandemic, then that's just really dangerous for people who aren't going to be able to work. Okay, so I guess I'm confused. It's going to be the end of the world if Amy Coney Barrett is confirmed to the Supreme Court, but also we're not really going to do anything about it. And this kind of doublespeak that comes from them, I think, really discredits a lot of this doomsday rhetoric about how everybody has to do everything they can to defeat Trump. And it's always it's always very self-serving, right? It's always about kind of deferring your power as an individual to this managerial class, right? Give us the power and we'll take care of you. It's never about empowering people, right? We're gonna suspend, put a moratorium on evictions. We're gonna freeze rent payments, something that would directly empower individuals during the corona crisis. No, we're going to help you by not shutting down the government so that then this person that we are on the one hand claiming is, going to be a disaster for this institution. It's just completely hypocritical. And I don't know how anybody is not aware that it's so openly a scam, right?
Right. I think we agree. It's extremely backwards, and you mentioned eviction moratorium, and I actually come from the deep blue state of Massachusetts. We do have a Republican governor, but the supermajority of the state legislature could not get it together to not let an eviction moratorium expire. And it does make you question the line of vote blue no matter who, and I think this gets to what Ted spoke about flattening everything left of center to be, well, it's better than the next thing. And I'm curious if you could speak and open this up to everyone, where this harm reduction argument falls apart, because Hannah mentioned the harm reduction aspect, the not wanting to stoke this kind of extreme right-wing rhetoric, but the other option isn't giving people anything material. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in the context of Biden, in some ways he's actually promised to sort of do more harm, or saying Trump isn't doing harm in the right way, right? His foreign policy is it's sort of doing imperialism in a sloppy fashion, and I'll do it in a much more directed, effective way. And so that's not a reason why I would vote for him. And I think, I find these arguments, like I said at the start, fairly weak. How if one party just says, we're going to do as much harm as possible, like that logically then means harm reduction also goes into an incredibly harmful area, which you can do a lot of harm and still be less harmful than the Republicans.
Exactly.
And so that kind of dynamic, like Jeremy brought up, the Graeber quote is true. The Democrats are always better than the Republicans, and that's not exactly wrong, but if that dynamic keeps happening, then where do you end up? And I definitely understand the desire to want to break with that and say, no, I'm rejecting all of that. And so like I said, I'm very sympathetic to that. I just think seeing what's happened now, where Trump gives the center left and even the center right total political cover, because they can say, oh, at least we're not Trump. I mean, like the Lincoln Project, for example. Like, you've had the reputations of these awful people that are responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people in the Middle East, who are now rehabilitated resistance heroes. And the flattening of everything from the center right to the left that I was talking about is the reason that something like the Lincoln Project is possible. And it does allow those kind of people to rehabilitate themselves. And that's why I would like to get Trump out of the White House, again, like I said, in order to draw actual distinctions from the neocons to Bernie Sanders. Those people should not have the same rhetoric right before an election.
But what I don't understand necessarily is one of the talking points that comes up again and again and again is, we'll elect Biden and we'll hold him accountable. The director of When They See Us, what is her name? Exactly, Ava DuVernay. She had this interview from a few weeks ago where she was saying that, all the people who are criticizing Biden, she said, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear that Kamala did this or Kamala did that. Here's what Kamala didn't do. And she lists the things that Trump has done, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It says basically left punching and saying that, people who are criticizing them are just listening to, they're just talking to hear themselves talk. Let's vote them in and hold them accountable. I just have one pretty simple question. How are you supposed to hold a party accountable when you have to vote for them? How? And what do you do when every single election is a catastrophe? And aren't we currently witnessing a downward trajectory in the United States? I think it's pretty obvious. But, okay, Obama was in office for 8 years, and it was the same type of policy. I mean, Joe Biden was his vice president, and that ended, with the election of Donald Trump. And then now we have a candidate that's more conservative and has a more problematic record than Obama had. It's just how long, are we going to keep on going down this whirlpool of pulling the conversation farther and farther to the right? In 10 years, are we going to be saying, oh yeah, Trump wasn't so bad? Because I see there's already been a bit of a rehabilitation of George Bush a little bit, and I'll just find myself being absolutely scandalized by some of these things. These memes will go around and be like, remember when you could disagree and it was the parties could disagree and it was okay, and you'll see a picture of Michelle Obama holding George Bush's hand, and I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, has my mind just touched a fucking void? Like, this dude is a fucking war criminal. Like, let's just not get it twisted. And I don't think that that's something that should be forgotten. And again, talking about Joe Biden, right, he came out and said in the last debate, right, that he was not opposed to Barrett, on the Supreme Court, necessarily because he said she was a very fine person. He objected to the way in which it was occurring. It shouldn't be happening in an election year. Why? Why is he not objecting to the content of what she is about as a jurist? Why isn't he speaking out against this? I just find myself just overwhelmed sometimes by the absolute and utter hypocrisy. How, I feel like liberals, they just sit and act as though they have, first of all, they have no power, and like they're just kind of these passengers on this sinking ship, and they have no ability to do anything. But on the other hand, come out and vote for us because we're going to fight for you. What? They approve his military budget. And it's as though no matter what they do, we're kind of strong-armed, or I say we, like the electorate is supposed to be strong-armed into voting for them. Well, it didn't really work last time. So why is it going to work this time? Like, we need a changing of the guard. That's what we need.
Why didn't it work last time? Why will it work this time? Kind of this return to normalcy. Ted's argument we're returning to normalcy by electing Joe Biden. We're going back to the Obama era when everybody could hold hands and disagree on a fundamental level and yet still like each other, and there's no real debate. But why didn't the left emerge under Obama? What happened there? If that
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a good question. Like, if I'm saying we're going to have a centrist presidency, and that'll allow the left to emerge. The obvious question would be like, why didn't that happen under Obama? We already had a centrist presidency after a horrible right-wing president. So why would it be better this time? And I think there's a few reasons for that. One is that Obama had a very unique ability to take left energy and excitement and sort of stir up a kind of pseudo-populist movement, but then use all of that energy and just transform it, either like subdue it or transform it into the pursuit of just these very centrist neoliberal policies. And he managed to do that both based on his oratorical skills, which I'm sure we're all quite aware that Biden utterly lacks. So I don't think we really need to worry about. No one thinks there's some great revolution coming when Biden wins, or that he's this inspirational figure who's going to lead some movement. So I don't think we'll get fooled on that count. And I think Obama was also able to use his personal biography as a very inspirational story. And I think in a way he managed the revolution was the success of one individual. It was an African-American man becoming president. And that stood in for actually political change because it was such a great representative change. And so again, Biden's an old white guy. No one is saying this is so unique and great that another old white guy is in the White House. So also on the identity level, no one's going to be fooled. And as well, I think the left is also just very different than it was, in 2008 or even a decade ago. I mean, one, it was able to be fooled by someone like Obama at the time, and you see the left's reaction to the sort of Pete Buttigieg type candidates who were sort of trying to echo Obama, and people were having nothing to do with that this time around. Like like I said, we're not fooled. And really, I mean, I think the left grew out of disillusionment with the Obama era in a way, and it didn't reach a critical mass in 2016 or 2020, but it is in a lot better shape, and I think knows where it's different from the center left and isn't going to take weak compromises as a solution anymore. I mean, you think about Elizabeth Warren, who's quite clearly shown her colors as not a true progressive, hindering the Bernie campaign. She was seen as the second coming when she was giving those speeches about Wall Street after the financial crisis. People were always playing those videos and sharing them. Oh my God, this is so great. So she sort of like a progressive technocrat passed as a left-wing firebrand then. And again, people aren't fooled. It's not going to happen. So I think, both the Biden presidency being different than the Obama presidency and the left itself being different makes it more hopeful this time.
I was also going to add to that it really takes time, because for example, I wouldn't want to romanticize what's going on in Poland right now, because there's a very easy way of thinking, oh, it's the revolution. They pushed us so hard. It's the change of, it's an uprising. But actually, it's not. It's really just the last chance for us to stop this, because this has been years in the making now. They've been, especially with reproductive rights, especially with trying to ban abortion, they've been doing this systematically. Once a year, there's been an attempt at least in the last 4 years. The first women's strike, was in October 2016. So it's really 4 years later that they have actually succeeded by going through the back door, actually through the courts, which is why this is also very dangerous with Amy Coney Barrett actually being confirmed, because the reason this is even happening is because the Constitutional Tribunal in Poland is completely politicized, because they've handpicked extremely right-wing, fundamentalist Christian judges for those spots, and they've pushed it through, and only 2 of them actually stood against the vote or the decision. So I would say I agree that it takes time to build a sort of movement, and it takes time to actually have organization. So this is the fact that they're on day 9 of protests and strikes. It's not because people are so angry, it's because they've actually been organizing for 4 years specifically around this issue, and they have the reach, they have the people, they have made this an issue. It's been made an issue from both sides, right? It's been made an issue by both the right wing, by peace being in power, because they've been attacking the specific human right, but also it's been made an issue by the activists because it's been in the news constantly and actually has changed public opinion on abortion rights in Poland, which is, now only about something, I think every poll says is about 11% that's actually for the ban. Everybody else is against it. Even a poll that came out, I guess 3 days ago, I'm not really sure where we are in the revolution days, but that said that 74% of people in the country are for the protests, or at least for the reason for the protests, maybe not for the protests because of COVID, but there was another poll asking that question. So I think it's really about time, and so I think it can be different, but also it's about the danger of what happens when Trump does get in, because you don't know what the consequences of that's going to be. In Poland, I guess we could expect the 2 groups that are going to be targeted by this, which is the LGBT community and abortion rights, or the women, asterisk, so everybody, people with uteruses in terms of abortion. But we didn't know that it was going to happen so quickly. They're using also Corona and the pandemic as kind of a distraction to be able to do this. And the other thing I wanted to say is, what do you do when you only have 2 choices? Because in Poland, you don't have only 2 choices in theory, and it's also a much younger democracy. The state apparatus is not as firmly stuck in its ways as it is in the US or the UK. In Poland, everything is still fairly, it's different. We joined the EU 17 years ago. Before that, the 90s were a complete chaos politically. Before that, we were under state socialism, in inverted commas. So it's also a bit different there, that there's perhaps more room to play, because it's not settled in the way that it is in other places. In the UK, for example, now with Jeremy Corbyn out of the picture, effectively, and Keir Starmer, who is the current leader of the Labour Party, one by one getting rid of the more left-wing MPs from positions of power in the party, it's kind of left everybody on the left with this kind of, what do we do now? Who do we go to? There isn't kind of anywhere that we can jump. There is no movement or group or anything that we can kind of grab onto to organize around it. So really, what should we do next election? Are we going to vote for Labour? Probably, because what are the other choices? We could vote for the Lib Dems, who are effectively, blue Tories, yellow Tories, whatever they're called, I forgot. Basically, they're Tories in disguise. And you could vote the Green Party, but they have 0 traction in the country, only in 2 constituencies. If you live in Scotland, you have a different choice. You can vote for the SNP, but they're probably won't be part of the UK by then anyway. So, so I don't know what would you do? I don't know what I'll do next election when there's no viable left-wing option, when the manifesto is effectively blue Labour. And the consequences, it's kind of the same thing, right? It's not going to be changed. It's much harder to change the politics there externally, because everything is so entrenched. We also have the House of Lords. They've put in so many life peers during the Conservative era, the last 10 years, that it's really difficult to get anything done, actually from either side. But externally there, how do you actually change a system that's been built and never actually really questioned in the way that it has in other places, which is why Poland maybe is also a slightly different case, because the system has been questioned a lot. The country has gone through a lot in the last, politically, in terms of the system changes in the last 100 years. I don't know, it's kind of throwing things out there. I don't really have an answer.
Well, to come back to what you were saying about, why didn't the left take off during the Obama presidency? I would say to a large extent it did. If you're talking about Black Lives Matter, that started under Obama, right? So, after the death of Trayvon Martin, women of color started this started Black Lives Matter, and it really, really took off and started to get like an international profile after the Ferguson uprisings in 2014. And then in the next year in 2015, there was another series of uprisings in Baltimore after Freddie Gray was killed by the police in Baltimore. And I would also say that I think it shouldn't be underestimated with what efficiency the centrist kind of corporate Democrats squashed any kind of like actual consent. It's funny, a friend of mine posted something on Facebook recently. It was like, it's time for the Democrats to start fighting dirty. And me being a person who's always kind of, I don't know, keyboard warrior, I really wanted to type, but they do fight dirty. They just fight dirty against leftists. But I didn't. I was like, okay, I didn't want to have that fight at that moment. And but it's true, right? During the primary this year, it was you would watch the coverage of Bernie Sanders, right, on CNN. And I distinctly remember watching this. There was one clip. It was definitely less than 2 minutes. I think they said heart attack. It was something like 7 times. It was like, yeah, Bernie Sanders and that heart attack that he had, heart attack, heart attack, heart attack, heart attack, heart attack, he's old, don't elect him, heart attack, heart attack. And then, now it's as though they've just forgotten they've even made that argument. You know what I mean? Because they elected this Joe Biden, essentially, and then he is, sometimes it's really quite plain that he's experiencing cognitive decline, and then now all of a sudden that's just not even an issue anymore. You know what I mean? And
you shouldn't be helping the Republicans.
But I mean, I think one of the things is that that the Democrats have not been, the mainstream corporate Democrats, right, have not yet had to be faced with their own failings, with the failings of centrism, which is, I think, kind of this undergirding ideology in the United States that is really, really widespread. This idea that the crazy people on the right and the crazy people on the left and the people in the center, these are the adults who are going to come in and they're going to give the solutions. But there's a study that I thought was absolutely interesting by David Adler from 2018. He wrote about it in the New York Times, that centrists, and he did this all over Europe and also in the United States, that centrists were the least likely to support democratic institutions, they were the least likely to support free elections, and they were the least likely to be supportive of civil rights. And I think, I mean, this is a speculation, but I think it has to do with when you're just really comfortable, you're just not necessarily concerned so much about maybe the people who are not as fortunate as you. And that, I think, is something that is really, really plaguing the Democratic Party right now. It's that they don't necessarily recognize their position of privilege. And you'll see this rhetoric, too, when it comes to about, if you don't vote or you vote for the party, it's just privilege. But again, Glenn Greenwald wrote this great article in April of this year about non-voters are not privileged. And there was a Pew poll from 2018 that found that, that in 2016, almost half of all non-voters were not white, even though they made up only 1/4 of the eligible electorate. More than half of non-voters, 56%, are quite poor, making less than $30,000 a year. 2/3 of non-voters are under 50, and about 30% of Americans were eligible to vote but choose not to. Anyway, so all that blabbering to say that this idea that the people who are not participating are privileged, that is just elitist propaganda. It's the other way around. The people who invest all of their trust and whose entire spectrum of political involvement is limited to electoral politics, they are the ones who are privileged. And I think that what's interesting now, for example, we saw in the spring with the uprisings after the murder of George Floyd, was that a lot of the kind of mainstream kind of propaganda that you hear about, oh yes, just get out and vote, and protesting, okay, that's great, and you saw these liberal mayors and stuff all over coming out and giving these teary speeches and talking as though they were just bystanders watching everything and not in a position to punish the police, but was when they burned down the police station in Minneapolis. 54% of the population either was kind of supported it or definitely supported it. The burning down a police station had a higher approval rating at that time than either Biden or Trump, right? And doesn't this just completely put lie to the notion that destructive demonstrations are alienating? It's not true. And I think one of the things that has to be really addressed is, I'm not saying that, okay, burn everything down, but I'm saying that we need to really look at maybe a variety of approaches and look at the extent of the desperation that has taken hold in the United States and why people were able to see the destruction of a state facility as a rallying cry. And that there needs to be an entirely new discussion about what methods need to be utilized to initiate the reforms that need to take place.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, Jeremy raises definitely a ton of good points. But as Hannah was saying, also about the time, just briefly back to that, like in the U.S. now, like you have the sort of broad middle classes do support a kind of social democratic agenda, and that has developed over the past decade or so. So I think, and it relates to what Jeremy was saying too, is like people are getting more and more disgusted with the system. It's just we don't necessarily have the political mechanisms for them to express that. Both in terms of wanting different healthcare policies than we've had before, and wanting liking to see a police station burned down. I mean, those are very different things, but they're different manifestations of the same disgust with the current system. So yeah, I think that is building, and they said centrism is a failure, and I completely agree. And I just think we need to make that as clear as possible as we can to people. And I don't think it's an accident that during the late Obama administration, 2015, Black Lives Matter and so on, that's when you see the broadest kind of rebellions against the status quo politics, because Obama wasn't up for re-election again. Everyone saw that his mode of politics just wasn't effective anymore. And you could kind of paint this, this lie that, he would do it, or there was that, hold on, I got this Obama meme, which, never happened, of course. He didn't got it. And but people realize that towards the end of it, and they get more and more fed up with it. And I think we can kind of take that disgust with centrist policies that started brewing at the end of Obama's term and hopefully transform that into continued growth for the left in the future. And just to your last point about sort of centrists being like very anti-democratic, I mean, I think it's a good point, because I think these people see themselves as sort of defending, they see themselves as Democrats, small d, yet sort of defending institutions against mass democracy, sort of like to save capitalism from democracy, or to save our courts from democracy. And sort of, they're democratic, but they also feel that excess democracy is a threat to their prized institutions, and hopefully we can move past that by showing that these institutions themselves are failures and not necessarily worth defending.
There was also, back to this Pew survey, I wanted to get this in as well. It says, indeed, the Pew survey of unregistered voters found that the most common cause for not registering is that they do not want to vote. And the most common reasons have nothing to do with voter suppression and everything to do with beliefs about the worthlessness of the elections. As Pew put it, 44% of eligible unregistered individuals say they do not want to vote, while 25% say they are unregistered because they have not been inspired by a candidate or issue.
Right, and then all the Democrats will get extremely angry and throw their hands up and say, why aren't people voting? And it's like this very pervasive idea they all have that like the system can never fail the people, and people just aren't interested in it, but the people themselves are failing the system, and that's the very like kind of anti-democratic centrist idea we were talking about.
Right, and I think we see that now, for example, with this discussion about court packing, right? Court packing, as they call it now, which it's already been packed. I was also very confused kind of about the pearl clutching with regard to, oh yes, Ruth Bader Ginsburg has died. Yes, like she was an important jurist, and obviously she was, particularly early in her career, very, very important as far as like, suing on behalf of women's rights and employment and things like that. But she was 87 years old. My first thought was, why the hell didn't she retire under Obama? That was the first thing. But then also, this idea that the Supreme Court was, in danger because Ruth Bader Ginsburg had passed away, and I'm thinking the Supreme Court was already right-wing. Am I losing my mind? I felt like, it always feels like the Democrats are encouraging people to fight over crumbs. And again, this is perfectly illustrated by how they dealt with, the nomination and then confirmation of Barrett was, yes, this is terrible, this is terrible, terrible, but go out and vote. Okay, so give us more power. We're not necessarily going to block anything. And then when there's an actual solution, presented, hey, let's expand the size of the Supreme Court. Republicans have, used these dirty tactics. They blocked Obama from replacing Scalia for over a year, et cetera, et cetera. Let's expand the size of the Supreme Court. I think I saw a meme that was by Reich, the economist in the States. And he said since like 1969, the Republicans have put 15 Supreme Court justices. They've confirmed 15 Supreme Court justices, and then Democrats have confirmed it was 4, I believe. This is obviously really problematic, especially since Democrats typically have won more. They've won the popular vote more often. So there's this whole discussion. Okay, what if the Supreme Court was just a bit bigger? And then Joe Biden's response was, well, we're going to have I'm going to get a panel of experts, and we're going to figure out what recommendations we can make. After 6 months, I'm not kidding, 6 months, we're going to have a 6-month panel. They're going to get together, and then they're going to give me recommendations about what we can do about the Supreme Court. I just find myself thinking, what do you need, dude? Like, what do you need?
Bipartisan panel,
Yeah. And it's like, what do you mean? The problem is it's been hijacked by right-wing reactionaries. I tend to get suspicious generally when liberals are really, really into studies. There's some of that going on, for example, at the moment here in Germany, right? There's this big discussion about, oh yes, we need to have this study about racism in the police force in Germany. And I just find myself thinking, and what are you going to do with that information? It's going to be led by who? And now it's gradually turning into, I think the compromise was that now it's going to be, well, we're going to have a study about, the daily life, the day-to-day work of police officers, because heaven forbid we actually acknowledge that racism is a problem in the police force. But I find myself at the end just thinking, what is going to be done with this information? It's never about empowering individuals, right? What can you do in these situations where police officers are being abusive to protect the person who is abused? Even if you create this, there's now discussion about an unabhängige Beschwerdestelle, an independent complaint office. Is that really going to solve the problem of people being abused on the street, or is it just going to be another kind of technocratic, bureaucratic institution?
To look like you're doing
exactly.
Doing something. And so, on that note, I do want to move beyond electoralism and talk a little bit more about mass movements. I'm going to read 2 comments. We're getting lots of questions. Jacob from Berlin wants to know, after this election, do you think you are going to work as hard on the next election, or are you going to focus on other aspects of activism? And kind of going along with that, Florent in France is asking, what are the best activist campaigns we can mount to show support for the Green New Deal, calls for racial justice, and other efforts from abroad? So just responding to that, how can we, besides voting, really affect change?
Well, I'd be curious, Hannah, how you feel the protests that you've been a part of, how that's been, and if you think you might be in a more kind of offensive rather than defensive position had the election gone the other way, and sort of how that also might relate to just sort of future protests about climate and so on.
It's a good question. It's hard to say because we've been in a defensive position for the last 4 years. We haven't had a chance to be, and that's the thing. This is actually part of the reason why I did vote for the centrist candidates, because I would have liked to see what it's like to be on the attack, to actually liberalize abortion, rather than to keep protecting and keep fighting for it not to be banned. And that's a very different kind of thing, and we just haven't had a chance to have this. We haven't had the opportunity to actually organize in this way. Everything is reactive to all the terrible things that are going on. And this is, I don't really know what to say. I wish I could say, oh, well, when you're on the attack, it's like this. But actually, we've never done it because it's always been taken away from us. And the more peace and their kind of cronies are entrenched in every kind of tentacle of power in Poland, the more and more on the defense we are on every front. In Poland there've been protests about the courts, from teacher strikes, there've been protests from the LGBT community and for abortion rights in the last year alone. You know, this is, I mean, and they were all massive. This current one is by far the biggest, but the teachers were on strike for weeks and weeks last year. So this is not, we're always fighting against something else, and it's organizing when, I do not know what it's like to organize when somebody who you vaguely think that you might have an influence on is in power. In the UK, there is no such organizing, actually. There was momentum when Jeremy Corbyn came into power that grew actually much earlier because they were very involved in his electoral campaign. But they were very much linked to him in the party. They were linked in trying to get candidates through on both a local and a national level, and a lot of the seats they targeted did actually go to Labour. But again, they were so linked with him that it's kind of all disappeared ever since he has lost the leadership. And again, there is not really somewhere that you can grasp and become and be active, because actually there's, you know, the only mass protests we've had have been about Brexit, and that is also a very complex issue, and that is not clear which party is for what, because it rather crosses, as you call it, crosses the aisle. And, you know, a lot of people credit actually the Brexit policy of the Labour Party they credit the demise of the Labour Party and under Jeremy Corbyn to the Brexit policy that they had. So it's not, I don't know, it's also difficult because when there is not an element of danger that something's going to be taken away from you, it's really hard to really rally people in the streets. The work has to look different. It won't be the same. It won't be mass. People go in the streets when it's the last moment, when they feel like they're losing something and they're just desperate. Every other kind of activist work or any other kind of organizing is much more boring, and there's very few people doing it. And I think that's something that you do need to be prepared for even when you're on the attack, because this kind of mass thing happens only at the very end when it's your kind of last chance to do something. I mean, but also, I really don't want to romanticize this kind of mass movement of people in the streets, because I mean, Belarus is on day 83 of people in the streets, and Lukashenko is still holding on to power. So it's not, I don't know, it's not easy. I think you'd have to be active on all fronts, and if there isn't a way to be on the attack, that's great, and we should try, but we always have to expect that there won't be as many people involved. I think the more these things are in the public eye, the more they're discussed, people do kind of get turned towards it, but the people who are not activists, who are not organizers, will not get involved unless there's like a real immediate need for them to be there. But I think having these conversations and having these moments of crisis does kind of turn people towards organizing, and when people become disenfranchised, where they feel disenfranchised because they don't feel like anybody or anything speaks for them anymore on the kind of grand level of politics, a lot of people do turn to it, and I think that's becoming more and more common, that people do turn towards kind of organizing, at least with something that they feel they can make a difference in. So I don't know, I think you just have to do kind of everything.
I could speak to that a bit. You know, our group, which was Germany for Bernie, and now is becoming, like Jeremy mentioned, one of the first international DSA chapters, DSA Berlin. I mean, we obviously started supporting an electoral movement, you know, Bernie Sanders' campaign for president. And when that fell apart, we had to think very hard about what to do and sort of where to go from there. And it would have been really easy to say, oh, well, you know, we lost, you know, just sort of disband the whole thing. We had up to a couple hundred people in total come around to phone bank and text bank and so on. And so, you know, we really didn't want to let that go. And I think the core of our group are all people that believes that viewing politics as something you do every 2 to 4 years when you cast your ballot is a very deeply flawed view of politics. Like, it's something you need to be involved in, you know, in terms of protests and mass movements and so on, like all of the time. And so that's why we decided to form this next group in order to keep up that momentum and keep activities, keep organizing well after the election. And, you know, for me, I've stayed active in the electoral work, continuing to phone bank for progressive candidates for the U.S. Congress. And, you know, I want to stay involved in that kind of work come the midterms and so on, but obviously not at the expense of other movements.
I I mean, it's also just a fact of the U.S. elections that they draw them out longer and longer. When did Bernie announce his campaign? Oh, it must have been over a year and a half before elections started, and that's on purpose. They're trying to channel all of our energy, all of our organizing into voting in a way from, and it was seen as this huge chance, like get Bernie elected. It would have been
and I think absolutely. I mean, it was sort of worth taking the risk, right, and saying, okay, it's a small chance, but it could be such a game changer that it's worth supporting. But I also think, there is a value to electoral politics and having leaders that represent certain things. I mean, you look at AOC, for example, who I have a lot of disagreements with, but her ability to excite very kind of middle of the road liberals and get them sort of behind a lot of more progressive policies because they are drawn to her rhetoric and her approach. I mean, that is a big gain, like there is a sort of core left, which is unfortunately too small now, and like the path to victory comes to bringing more people into politics, but I think also convincing some of those sort of hesitant suburbanite liberal type people that I was saying, on paper support a social democratic agenda. They just haven't come around to it electorally yet. And so having some leaders that can voice those kind of policies in a way that's appealing to more people does have a value, and then can encourage larger mass movements and hopefully create a kind of virtuous cycle there.
I would say about what you were asking about, what the person asked, about how to participate in and support movements in other countries. I think just look at what's going on, locally. For example, after the murder of George Floyd, it was really, really interesting. People were coming up to me, in restaurants and stuff, and talking to me about it. There's a place near me, there's a Thai restaurant that's near me, and this guy who works there is like, hey, what do you think about what's happening in the United States? Like, people were just like, wow, it's so outrageous. But there's this kind of tendency to look at another country or another place and say, wow, it's so terrible there. And then something really interesting happened here. It was like German activists and organizations like Each One Teach One and all these organizations that deal with anti-racism and racist police brutality were able to kind of turn the conversation like, actually, let's shine a light on what's happening right here in Germany. And I think that is incredibly, incredibly important. There have been cases in France. There's now this SARS, it is happening in there have been African countries where there are Black Lives Matter movements. I think that's just the best way that you can do it. You look at what's happening locally. You say, hey, this is a problem here. Or for example, when there is a cause for economic justice, and then you look to this country and say, hey, in that country, they were able to do this. That was one of the hallmarks of Bernie Sanders' rhetoric, right? Well, look at these Scandinavian countries. They've managed to do this, blah, blah, blah. When you have something that you can look at, and you can say, look, they were able to do this. And then it's really invigorating, because you're not just talking about pipe dreams then, right? That transformative politics is possible. Like, what's happening in Chile, for example, right? I was reading about that recently, and I'm thinking, wow, like what that must be like to just to witness in real time, transformative politics, not these kind of cosmetic, shuffling around of institutional figures and creating another impenetrable institution that pretends to be doing something that it's not really doing, but really functions as like a PR apparatus. I think that those things are incredibly important. And I think that that's what I would say to people who, for example, wanted to support Black Lives Matter. It's just, there are probably some black lives in your country. You know what I mean?
I'm going to read another question from Rosa, coming from Kreuzberg. She's talking about social movements have animated media landscapes these past years. However, we see their co-optation. Black Lives Matter endorsed Warren, as did the leadership of the Working Families Party. Despite the base not being on board in both cases, what is the hope for large social movements in the next 4 years? So how do we kind of prevent them from being co-opted?
I think that's impossible.
Yeah.
Well, just a little example from this week is that two men that this kind of powerful-ish on the center, which is Trzaskowski, who was the presidential candidate in the summer, and also Szymon Hołownia, who was also a candidate who was kind of the runner-up in that. They're both very much in the center, to the center-right. And they've both been trying to score political points with what's been going on in the last 9 days. And they've both made statements about what's happening, and I don't know, it's not possible for them not to be co-opted, because at some point people see, okay, people are unhappy, I must win this because they already have the power, right? So I think the women's strike leaders are trying to hold on quite strongly, but at the end of the day, it is not a left-wing movement. And the moment a movement becomes a mass movement, it is very rarely a left-wing movement anywhere in the world, because when it's about a single issue, it tends to be about that particular issue, and then everything else is as broad as there are people in the street. So at the moment, there is kind of a struggle to keep the messaging about abortion rights or the abortion ban, because everything else has kind of been about just saying, well, actually the slogan is fuck peace, or fuck off peace, but that's kind of muddling the message, right? Because it's saying, okay, there's about a million other issues people have with this ruling party, and I think also at the end of the day, the left in any of the places we've been talking about tonight is not strong in the sense of having political capital in kind of the grand areas of politics, right? None of them are in power, and they're not going to be in power anytime soon. We had it in the UK and we lost it, and now I think it's lost for some time. So I think in that sense, I don't see how, I think being co-opted also, like, what does that mean? By whom? Because I think for us, if a movement is left-wing and it's quite clearly socialists in the streets or workers in the streets, great. But we're not going to have the same workers' revolution that we would have had when people were working in factories and mines, because that looks very different to how it did. It's just a very different climate and kind of environment we're in now. So I think it's really difficult. I just don't really know what it means co-opting, because unless we have a clearly left-wing movement, I just don't think any movement that we're talking about here that's been in the streets is left-wing in the sense of we all agree on like also the economic policy, and we agree on like what everything else should look like. And certainly in Poland right now, there is the breadth of people. There are peace voters. There are in the streets with the women right now, because it's about a single issue, right? So like, how can they keep the momentum going and not feel like they're kind of being co-opted? I mean, the moment they kind of go broader beyond this one issue, then it is being co-opted in a sense, right?
Well, how do you mean?
Well, because people, one of the postulates they've raised this week is that they want to get rid of the government. But then what does that mean if they say they succeed? I hope they do. I honestly, with all my heart, really hope that this is the end of peace and the way that the political system is in Poland. But what if they succeed? What does that mean? Like they have postulates, and I agree with most of them, but they also put in, for example, they demand workers or fair workers' rights, but also they demand rights for entrepreneurs and employers.
But I don't understand necessarily I don't understand the connection between that and like how a movement in and of itself cannot be left-wing. I don't understand.
No, I'm saying the movements that we've been talking about.
Okay.
Because the breadth of people that are in the streets, maybe just in my experience.
I mean, I think that the issue is that, like, obviously somebody can be quite progressive on one issue and maybe not as much on another. But I also think that one of the big problems is that that there's not enough of kind of an overarching connective fabric to like left-wing politics. Like there was this great interview with Celine Berry. She was at Each One Teach One now. I think she's going to work in academia. Very, very smart woman, and she did an interview in Neues Deutschland a couple of weeks ago, and she was talking, for example, about this racism study, and she thought it was also ridiculous. She said, "Bill, by who, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." And she said, "Well," she was asked, what would be a good way to fight, discrimination? And she said, "You have to kind of change the way the society functions, right? There's no way to get around that, right? Who has which rights? If you're, an Ausländer, if you're a foreigner here in Germany, you simply do not have as many rights as a person who was born here, which then legitimizes your criminalization. So you can't really separate these things, because then how the police work is also connected to capitalism, right? Like a woman not being allowed to have an abortion is essentially saying, okay, this, you are being, first of all, it's a massive invasion of the bodily autonomy of a woman, first of all, and then you have this whole issue of the economic issue. Well, how is this person supposed to raise this child? How is the government going to help in this regard? So I think one of the issues is, and it's kind of a double-edged sword, is that these movements, they have to kind of embrace this complexity of everything, right? But the difficulty is that, it's like you said, it's easier to rally around one particular cause, but it's kind of like you also have to cook into your politics, cook into your platform, this kind of intersectionality. I did a speech, for example, a couple of weeks ago at Fridays for Future. They did a big, march a couple of weeks ago. And, I did a speech about why, there aren't more people of color involved in climate activism. And it's because I think because there are simply more pressing issues for people of color. If you're from an African country and you're in Germany and you don't have, a right to be here, you're going to prioritize that over, climate change. I'm sorry, that's just more acute. That issue is just more acute. The problem is, though, every movement then being like an LGBTIQAIA+, and then plus immigration, and then it kind of has to be that way, but then it's kind of also overwhelming, right? And so it becomes a big issue of communication, I think. But I also think that political movements, social movements rather, and politics should also have a little bit of separation between them. Like there was a reason why Martin Luther King Jr. would not support one party over the other. Okay, the political landscape was different back then. It wasn't just all the conservative quacks in one party, et cetera, et cetera. But his issue was that he wanted to address the issue of racism. And yes, he's now known for having defeated or helped defeat Jim Crow segregation, but he also had this whole slew of democratic socialist ideas that are completely whitewashed and ignored, because it's not really possible, I don't think, to support these things in any kind of meaningful way without also kind of supporting a whole lot of other things that intersect with them, is kind of what I would say,
Yeah, I guess the question is whether you're hoping for quick change or whether you're hoping, whether it's going to be a drawn-out thing, right? Because in what you're talking about, which is, I agree with you also, the social movement thing, it's slow. It takes a long time, and rallying around one issue is much easier to get people out in the streets and get passionate about, because then it doesn't matter that you disagree on about a million other issues, because you care about this one particular issue. That's kind of what I meant, because the moment it becomes bigger than that, the moment it kind of goes beyond that one issue, then that's when you kind of hit problems, and then that's when there's no consensus. That's why a lot of things fall apart. I'm talking just from a perspective of a country that's gone through a lot of changes in its political system in the last however many years, centuries. This happened exactly in the 80s in Poland, but they went out in the streets in 1980, led by the Solidarity trade union, which actually then became legal through that. And yes, they achieved their postulates, but then they also brought the army out in the street, and the regime change didn't happen for another 9 years, right? Because the moment that they disagreed on other issues, then it fell apart and they got squashed. So I agree, but then of course, if we want big change, it's just so slow. And I know that we can, in our circles, it's really easy to say and feel, oh God, it's great, people are really learning. And I think people are really learning about a lot of things, and very quickly, because of this very quick world we're living in. But it's also not, I think that's what I meant by the co-option. Also, forgive me if I'm not being coherent today, because it's been a very difficult week. But
I guess, when I think about movements getting co-opted, like you said, there's several different ways for that to happen, right? One is sort of becoming too broad or moving too much to the center and then losing your focus. The other that I think of, and it sounded like the question might be alluding to this a bit, is like the professionalization and kind of NGO-ification of social movements, where they go from mass protests and a fairly organic thing to this very institutionalized setup. Maybe the Working Families Party is a good example of this, where sort of a more institutionalized NGO setup. And it's tough, there's a tension between these things, because you want to be professional and you want to be able to kind of get your message out and have good communications and sort of compete with other organizations in the media landscape. But at the same time, then I think you lose something, because then these things that used to be social movements essentially become elite organizations to get into, to boost your career or put on your CV or something like that. And so, I think it's okay for organizations to grow and mature, but it's extremely important to not lose sight of how that started and keeping it rooted in the actual activists that started that organization, and not just having a bunch of fancy college graduates kind of running it, and then it alienates the mass base of support because they think that this organization is not for me anymore.
Definitely. I mean, I think we saw that also with the Black Lives Matter movement, this kind of sloganeering approach of the Democratic Party where they can pay all the lip service they want by putting out statements, and then they say, well, that's the end of that. Don't look at how we fund the police. Don't look at anything material.
Exactly. And then you have somebody like Joe Biden who said, he wants to give the police more money, and then somehow wants to invest more in community policing, but not do it in the racist way. It's like, okay, whatever. It's just a great big nothing burger,
That's the other kind of form of co-optation, right? Rather than being co-opted from the inside by a kind of professional class, but co-opted from the outside either by corporations, which you saw in a disgusting way with Black Lives Matter, obviously, but also political parties. And people should be really wary of this, because the Democrats have a long history of doing this. You look at the anti-war movement during the Iraq War, and they say, okay, well, similar today, the one thing you can do, the most important thing you can do to fight the Iraq War is to support Democrats. And so 2006, big wave, right? They get swept into the majority. And then all of those movements kind of just die and disappear into this behemoth of the Democratic Party. And so, it's tough, because as a movement, you want to actually affect political change and influence leaders, but you need to not let that influence go the other way. It's easy to think that you're convincing them and they're really just sucking you in and killing you slowly, which the Democrats are extremely good at doing. So.
Right. All right, I'm going to throw out another question. A lot of people are wondering about the DSA just kind of becoming only working electorally. And so Pamela is asking, does the DSA honestly think that it's going to influence Biden if he wins the election, even after the Dems sank their candidate? Is the DSA, doesn't this electoralism that has taken over the organization reduce the DSA to a pressure group? What kind of political leadership is it providing for a new generation of people who may want something more than Democrats? And along those lines, some unnamed commenters have been asking, is there a path to an independent working class mass party in the U.S.? People are kind of wondering if these organizations, DSA, Our Revolution, Justice Democrats, Working Families Party, like we talked about, and then the movement Sunrise, Black Lives Matter, March for Our Lives, we have so much in common and must coordinate, collaborate, unite. Is that possible, having an inside-outside approach, focus on the Democratic Party, or do we need a third party?
I mean, to me, you heard me earlier, I guess, like in the U.S. or like the U.K., for example, any kind of first-past-the-post system, to me, a third party is pretty untenable, unfortunately. So, yeah, I do think that the kind of inside-outside approach does make the most sense in a lot of ways. I think this idea that we're going to push Biden left is a totally flawed idea. If the left had the power to push Biden, Biden wouldn't be the nominee in the first place. So that to me makes very little sense. But I do think at the local level, for campaigning for local races or any kind of down ballot races, like for the Congress, you have seen a lot of candidates come out of the DSA and then get into office that have made a name for themselves, have kind of boosted these movements, and I do think offer some degree of hope. So I think that's really where the focus should be on an electoral level. If another candidate like Bernie comes along, I think it's worth going all in again for that. But focusing as like the question said, as a pressure group on Biden, to me, like, his campaign ran a sticker saying, "I'm not a socialist," or had socialism crossed out on the bumper sticker. I'm a Democrat, not a plutocrat or a socialist. Like, this idea that an organization that has socialist in the name is going to have any influence over him is completely delusional. And so I think you need to look for other ways to have influence.
I would say even things like this, and encouraging people to organize and communicate and share ideas that are not kind of within this very within the confines of this very, very limited discourse that dominates in the mainstream media coverage of politics in the United States. I think things like that are also just really important. Or striking, if you're striking for wages, organizing, creating unions, anything that encourages people, that empowers them, that doesn't just expect them to just kind of defer their power to the managerial class, I think would be something that I would encourage.
I do think Americans suffer from a crisis of the imagination, and just having an organization like the DSA who says this better world is possible, working from the outside, is a great thing to do. I'm going to ask another question from online. Okay. I do want to give you two a chance to talk about the DSA in Berlin and go back to kind of this question about from abroad, what are some activities that have worked well for Berlin DSA, if we can just kind of talk about what we're planning to do.
Yeah, absolutely. We can maybe do some plugs at the end and talk about that.
Then I think this is kind of wrapping up. Does Hannah want to talk about what is going on with your group this upcoming week?
Sure.
Let's start there.
So in the we've had now 2 protests in the last week, both which had more than 1,000 people out in the street, which is great, but also means, it's sad that we have to do it, but great that so many people are angry. We have another protest this Sunday by the Polish War Memorial in Polska Friedrichshain at 5 p.m, where we're going to do something a bit more artistic. Something involving lights and maybe costumes, we're not sure yet, but if you want to come and see what we've come up with. But we're also encouraging people to go and blockade the embassy, or inverted commas blockade, just visit the embassy and leave them some souvenirs like hangers or slogans or anything you want without destroying anything. Then we encourage people to do that too. If there's a lot of ways you can also join and show solidarity for what's going on in Poland online by sharing what's happening, by donating to, there's this particularly important collective here that works with Polish women who come to Berlin specifically for abortions, which is called Ciocia Basia. And they have a big fundraising campaign right now because, of course, if this ban does get upheld, then there will be more and more Polish women coming across the border. And there's already, we think, there's thousands every year that do this anyway, and there'll be only more. So if you have money that you could spare, that they really need it, and they will need it. And from next week we have lockdown, so we'll see what's going on, and we'll kind of just keep an eye on what's going on. We're only 90 kilometers away, so actually it's quite an important place to also keep looking at what's going on. Plus the head of the Constitutional Tribunal that pushed the ban actually lives in Berlin because she is married to the Polish ambassador to Germany. So it's particularly important to show her that people here know that, A, that she's here, and B, that people are very unhappy. But, yeah.
So.
Yeah, for us, coming up, we have our final phone banking this Sunday, 6 p.m. That'll be online because of COVID, but we're calling for candidates like Rashida Tlaib, Beth Dolio in Washington. So sort of final push before the election in terms of the electoral stuff. After that, we'll be having a meeting on the 5th to discuss the election, potentially some sort of protests or demonstrations after the election, depending on how that goes and how the president reacts to that. And then After that, yeah, we're organizing a recurring reading group, and then also just partnering with local movements like Deutsche Wohnen und Co. enteignen. I know Michelle's active with them. Green New Deal, other groups here, and so we really see ourselves as like building a bridge to a lot of other left groups here. We're a couple months old, and so we're still kind of figuring out the most effective way that we can not kind of not distract any attention from other groups, but really contribute people to different movements and build bridges between them. And you definitely do not have to be an American citizen to join. So yeah, to stay in touch, definitely follow us at Berlin DSA, and that'll, yeah, you can keep tabs on what we're doing. And yeah, I mean, in terms of organizing post-election, we've been so focused on this election for a really long time that, yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how that develops. A lot of it will depend on, on how the election goes and sort of whether we're going to be in this sort of very defensive posture that you talk about with Poland, or can hopefully try to be in a more offensive stance. But regardless, things like Black Lives Matter, Green New Deal, climate protests, those aren't going to resolve themselves if Biden wins. Like we all know that. So definitely staying active in those types of movements.
The DSA Berlin is going to be having a meeting on Zoom on Thursday, so 2 days after the election. If you just want to talk about the outcome, if you want to get involved, I definitely encourage you to join that meeting. And all of this information, if you just Google the Left Berlin, there's a great events calendar on the website of the Linke Internationals. You can get connected to all of these movements, events that are happening. There's also this Wednesday, got a big week coming up next week. Wednesday night, there's a film and discussion, which was originally going to be at Movimento Cinema, but now all the cinemas are closed, so it's happening online. For the film Against the Tide, we actually have the director and one of the main protagonists joining for the discussion. That'll also be on the Left Berlin website. Google the Left Berlin, follow the social media channels. I just want to end on a note from Bruce in Vienna, who commented, "There will be another Bernie candidate. It may be one of you. What do you think?" So thank you, Bruce. Thank you to everybody who tuned in, and also thank you to AQUA for providing the space. Please go to their Patreon and support this community center. It's wonderful to be here. I feel so much better talking about these things, and we want them to continue to have a place in this community. So thank you all so much. Thanks to our panelists.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.